There is something profound about touching a fragment of the past, something that whispers across the centuries in a language older than words. And tonight, we find ourselves drawn into the quiet world of those who listen to these whispers, who brush away the dust of ages with patient hands, who seek to understand the lives that came before. The archaeology of human memory is written in layers, preserved in earth and stone, in the careful arrangement of objects that once meant something to someone, in the remains of fires that warmed hands now long turned to dust. And as we move through this landscape of discovery, we become witnesses to a conversation between then and now, between what was and what we are still learning to understand. Imagine standing at the edge of an excavation site, just as the sun begins to trace its golden light across the exposed earth, the air cool and still, the world holding its breath in that liminal moment between darkness and day, and before you, descending into the ground in neat measured squares, lies a window into another time, each layer a page in an unwritten book, each artifact a sentence waiting to be read. The trowel in a hand feels both heavy and light, a simple tool, yet one that carries the weight of responsibility, because what lies beneath the surface is fragile, irreplaceable, and the work of uncovering it requires not just technique, but reverence, a kind of conversation with the past that demands we listen more than we speak. The soil itself tells stories, its color shifting from the rich brown of recent deposits to the lighter clay of older strata, sometimes marked by thin dark lines where ancient hearths once burned, or where organic material decomposed and left its signature in the earth. And as we remove each layer, measuring, photographing, recording every detail, we are not simply digging, we are reading, translating the physical remnants of human experience into understanding. There is a particular quality to the morning light at such a place, the way it illuminates the texture of the ground, revealing subtle variations that might otherwise go unnoticed, a slight discoloration that hints at a post hole, a scatter of stones that suggest a structure, a concentration of charcoal that speaks of domestic life, of meals prepared, of warmth sought, of the ordinary moments that constitute the fabric of existence. And in these moments, standing at the threshold between earth and air, between past and present, there is a sense of profound connection, because the people who left these traces were not so different from us. They sought shelter and sustenance. They created beauty and meaning. They loved and grieved and wondered about the world around them. And though their languages are silent now, though their names are lost to time, their presence remains encoded in the things they made and used and left behind. The work unfolds slowly, deliberately, because archaeology is not about treasure hunting or dramatic discoveries. Though those moments do come, it is about patience, about the careful documentation of context, because an artifact divorced from its surroundings loses much of its voice. A pottery sherd found in isolation tells us one thing, but that same sherd found alongside others, in association with stone tools and food remains, in a layer that can be dated, within a structure whose purpose can be inferred, tells us so much more. We learn to see what is not immediately visible, to recognize patterns in the distribution of materials, to understand that empty spaces can be as meaningful as filled ones. That absence is itself a form of evidence, and gradually, through the accumulation of small observations, a picture begins to emerge, not complete, never complete, but suggestive, evocative, rich with possibility. The past reveals itself in fragments, in pieces that must be carefully fitted together like a puzzle with no picture on the box to guide us. And yet, there is beauty in this incompleteness because it invites interpretation, imagination tempered by evidence, hypothesis tested against the physical record, and in this process, we discover not just what ancient peoples did, but how they thought, what they valued, how they understood their world. And so we begin this journey through the landscape of archaeological discovery, through the methods and insights that allow us to touch vanished worlds, to walk in the footsteps of those who came before, not rushing, but moving with the same patient attention that the work itself demands, letting each detail unfold in its own time, each revelation adding another thread to the tapestry of human history that we are slowly, carefully, reverently weaving from the evidence buried beneath our feet. The formal discipline of archaeology, as we understand it today, emerged slowly from centuries of curiosity about ruins and relics, from the human impulse to wonder about the builders of ancient monuments, the makers of strange objects found in fields and riverbanks. And though people have always been interested in the remnants of earlier times, the transformation of this interest into systematic study, into science, required a fundamental shift in thinking, a movement away from treasure-seeking and toward understanding. In the centuries before archaeology became a discipline, the discovery of ancient objects was often treated as confirmation of classical texts, or as curiosities to be collected without regard for where they were found or what surrounded them. Wealthy Europeans undertook grand tours, visiting ruins in Greece and Rome, Egypt and the Near East, sometimes sketching what they saw, often removing sculptures and inscriptions to adorn their estates. And while these activities preserved some artifacts, they also destroyed irreplaceable contextual information, separating objects from the stories they might have told. The 18th century brought the first stirrings of more careful observation, when volcanic ash was cleared from Herculaneum and Pompeii, revealing Roman cities frozen in time, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed them. And here, for the first time, observers could see not just isolated, beautiful objects, but entire streetscapes, houses with their furniture and decorations intact, ordinary implements of daily life, bakeries with bread still in the ovens, graffiti on the walls, and this completeness, this window into the totality of ancient life, began to suggest new possibilities for understanding the past. But the excavations at these sites, though revelatory, were still conducted with methods that would horrify modern archaeologists, tunneling through ash like miners, removing portable objects while leaving architecture and context poorly recorded, driven more by the desire to fill museums and private collections than by the impulse to document and understand. And yet, these imperfect beginnings planted seeds, raising questions about what could be learned if the work were done more carefully, more systematically. The 19th century witnessed the acceleration of archaeological activity, particularly as European colonial powers expanded their reach, and ancient sites in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean became subjects of intense interest, sometimes rivalry, as nations competed to claim the most spectacular finds. The largest statues, the most impressive inscriptions, and while much was learned, much was also lost, as excavations proceeded without adequate recording, without understanding that the relationships between objects, their position in the ground, the layers in which they were found, held information as valuable as the objects themselves. It was during this period that certain individuals began to advocate for more rigorous methods for the careful observation and documentation of excavations, and among these pioneers, one name stands out for establishing principles that would shape the discipline for generations. Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, a Danish antiquarian who in the 1820s organized the collections of the National Museum in Copenhagen according to a revolutionary system, dividing artifacts into 3 ages: stone, bronze, and iron, based on the materials from which tools and weapons were made. This 3-age system, as it came to be known, provided the first broad chronological framework for prehistory, a way of organizing time before written records, and though it was based primarily on typology, on the classification of artifact forms, it represented a crucial conceptual advance, the recognition that material culture changed over time in patterned ways, and that these patterns could be used to build a relative chronology, to say that this type of object is older than that type, even without absolute dates. Thomsen's contemporary, Jacques Boucher de Perthes, was making equally significant observations in the gravel pits of northern France, where he found stone tools in association with the bones of extinct animals in deposits clearly predating the biblical flood that many still believed had reshaped the earth. And though his claims were initially met with skepticism, even ridicule, eventually, as more evidence accumulated, the scientific community began to accept that human antiquity extended far deeper into the past than previously imagined, that people had lived alongside mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses in an Ice Age world vastly different from the present. These revelations, that humanity was far older than the few thousand years allowed by traditional biblical chronology, and that human cultures had evolved through distinct technological stages, laid the groundwork for archaeology as a scientific pursuit, one grounded in observation and evidence rather than in the authority of ancient texts. And as the 19th century progressed, excavations became more systematic, more attentive to stratigraphy, to the principle that lower layers are generally older than those above them, a concept borrowed from geology, from the work of Charles Lyell and others who were revolutionizing the understanding of Earth's history. The latter decades of the 1800s saw archaeology begin to professionalize, to develop standards and methods. And one figure who exemplified this transition was Augustus Pitt Rivers, a British general who brought military precision to excavation, insisting on careful measurement, detailed recording, and the preservation of all finds, not just the spectacular ones, recognizing that ordinary domestic items could reveal as much about past societies as elaborate treasures, that pottery sherds and animal bone, when properly studied, told stories about diet and trade and daily routines. Pitt Rivers excavated sites on his estate in southern England with meticulous attention to detail, creating scale models of the excavations, detailed drawings, comprehensive reports, and his insistence that everything be recorded, that humble artifacts mattered as much as fine ones, represented a philosophical shift, a recognition that archaeology's goal was not to fill museums with beautiful objects, but to reconstruct past lifeways, to understand how people lived, worked, believed, organized their societies. Across the Atlantic in North America, archaeology was developing along somewhat different lines, shaped by the encounter with indigenous peoples and their material culture, and by questions about the origins of the impressive earthworks and mounds found throughout the eastern woodlands and the Mississippi Valley. Who had built these structures, and when, and why, became subjects of intense speculation, often influenced more by ideology and prejudice than by evidence. Some early observers refused to believe that the ancestors of contemporary native peoples could have created such impressive monuments, instead attributing them to lost races, to wandering Phoenicians or Welsh princes or the lost tribes of Israel, anything but the indigenous nations who actually were their descendants. And it would take decades of patient work, of excavation and analysis and the slow accumulation of evidence before archaeology would definitively demonstrate the Native American origin of these sites, connecting them to documented historical cultures through continuities in artifact styles and settlement patterns. Thomas Jefferson, in 1784, conducted what might be considered one of the first scientific excavations in North America when he trenched a burial mound on his Virginia property, not simply to collect artifacts, but to answer questions about its construction and purpose, observing the layers within the mound, noting the arrangement of burials, drawing conclusions based on evidence rather than speculation. And while his methods were rudimentary by modern standards, his approach, hypothesis-driven and evidence-based, anticipated the scientific archaeology that would develop a century later. As the 19th century drew to a close, archaeology was establishing itself as a discipline distinct from antiquarianism and treasure hunting, developing systematic excavation techniques, grappling with questions of chronology and cultural change, and beginning to see artifacts not merely as objects to be collected, but as evidence to be interpreted as the material traces of human behavior and thought. And this shift from collection to interpretation, from object to context, would define the archaeology of the 20th century and beyond. The turn of the century brought new theoretical frameworks, new technologies, and an expanding geographic scope as archaeologists worked in an ever-widening array of environments, from the Arctic to the tropics, from caves to underwater sites, and each new setting demanded adaptations of method, new ways of seeing and recording, new questions about how people adapted to different challenges, how they exploited available resources, how they shaped and were shaped by their environments. But even as methods improved and knowledge accumulated, archaeology retained something of its origins, that sense of wonder at touching the past, at uncovering what was hidden, at bringing to light the traces of lives lived long ago, and this dual nature, part science and part humanistic inquiry, part rigorous analysis and part imaginative reconstruction, continues to characterize the discipline, to make it both intellectually demanding and deeply satisfying, a bridge between past and present, built from fragments patiently gathered and carefully studied. The early 20th century brought with it a figure whose influence would reshape archaeology as profoundly as anyone before or since. Mortimer Wheeler, a British archaeologist whose innovations in excavation, technique, and presentation transformed the discipline from a pursuit of scattered enthusiasts into a rigorous science with standardized methods, and yet who never lost sight of the human stories embedded in the earth, the drama of past lives that careful excavation could reveal. Wheeler developed what became known as the box grid system, a method of excavation that left standing walls of earth bulks between excavated squares, preserving stratigraphic sequences in cross-section where they could be observed and recorded, and this seemingly simple innovation allowed archaeologists to see the layering of deposits in 3 dimensions to understand not just what was found, but where precisely it lay in relation to everything else, and how the accumulation of material had occurred over time. His excavations in the 1920s and 30s at sites like Maiden Castle in England, with its massive Iron Age ramparts, demonstrated the power of these methods, revealing not just the construction sequence of the fortifications, but evidence of the violent Roman assault that ended the site's occupation, skeletons still bearing the marks of sword cuts and ballista bolts, scattered where they fell 2,000 years ago, and Wheeler's ability to weave these discoveries into compelling narratives, to bring the past alive through vivid reconstruction, helped establish archaeology in the public imagination as something more than dusty artifact collecting. But Wheeler was not alone in advancing the field during this period. Across Europe and beyond, archaeologists were developing new approaches to old questions, learning to read landscapes as palimpsests of human activity, to recognize patterns in settlement location and artifact distribution that revealed ancient systems of land use and social organization, and they were beginning to apply scientific techniques, using pollen analysis to reconstruct past environments, studying soil chemistry to identify activity areas within sites, employing ever more sophisticated methods of dating and analysis. In the American Southwest, archaeologists were developing dendrochronology, tree ring dating, pioneered by Andrew Ellicott Douglas in the early 1900s, who recognized that trees in the region's arid climate produced distinctive annual growth rings, and that patterns in these rings could be matched across specimens, creating a master chronology extending back centuries. And when wooden beams from ancient pueblos could be fitted into this sequence, for the first time archaeologists could assign precise calendar dates to prehistoric structures, could say with confidence that this room was built in 1292, that beam cut in 1307. This breakthrough, the ability to date sites absolutely rather than merely relatively, revolutionized southwestern archaeology, allowing researchers to track the rise and fall of the cultures with unprecedented precision, to see how communities grew and dispersed in response to drought, to warfare, to social and environmental pressures, and the method would eventually be refined and extended, with bristlecone pine chronologies reaching back thousands of years, providing a dating framework and a climate proxy of extraordinary value. The middle decades of the 20th century saw archaeology grappling with larger questions of cultural change and human adaptation, moving beyond the description of individual sites to attempt broader syntheses, seeking patterns that might explain why societies developed as they did, why some flourished while others collapsed, how innovations spread, how social complexity emerged, and these questions demanded not just careful excavation, but theoretical frameworks for interpreting what was found. V. Gordon Childe, an Australian archaeologist working primarily in Britain, proposed influential models of prehistoric development, identifying what he called the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life, and the urban revolution, the emergence of cities and state-level societies. And while his specific reconstructions have been refined and challenged by subsequent research, his emphasis on broad patterns, on understanding cultural change in terms of technological and economic transformations, helped shift archaeology toward more explicitly anthropological concerns. The post-war period brought new dating methods that would transform the discipline as profoundly as dendrochronology had transformed southwestern archaeology. Radiocarbon dating, developed by Willard Libby in the late 1940s, exploited the fact that all living things contain radioactive carbon-14, which begins to decay at a known rate after death. And by measuring the remaining carbon-14 in organic materials, archaeologists could estimate when a plant or animal had died, when a wooden post had been cut, when a bone had been deposited in the ground. This method extended the reach of absolute dating far beyond what tree rings could provide, allowing archaeologists to date materials tens of thousands of years old from any part of the world, and though the technique required refinement, calibration against known age samples to correct for variations in atmospheric carbon-14 over time, it provided an unprecedented chronological framework. Suddenly, sites across the globe could be placed in time. Cultural developments in different regions could be compared. Questions about the tempo and direction of change could be addressed with new confidence. As radiocarbon dating became routine, archaeology entered what some called its processual phase, a movement toward more explicitly scientific methods and goals, championed by archaeologists like Louis Binford, who argued that the discipline should not merely describe past cultures, but explain them, should formulate and test hypotheses about human behavior, should seek general laws, or at least robust generalizations about how societies work and change. This new archaeology, as it was sometimes called, emphasized rigorous methodology, quantitative analysis, the explicit statement of assumptions, and the testing of alternative hypotheses, and it brought new sophistication to the study of settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, exchange networks, all the material traces of economic and social organization. But it also faced criticism for seeming to reduce human experience to abstract processes, for neglecting the symbolic and ideological dimensions of culture, the meanings that people themselves attached to their actions and creations. The response to processual archaeology came in various forms, but perhaps most influentially in what became known as post-processual or interpretive archaeology, which emphasized that the past, unlike the subjects of natural science, was constituted by meaningful human action, that artifacts were not just tools and trash, but symbols, that understanding past societies required attention to belief systems and worldviews, to the ways people created and negotiated meaning through material culture. And yet, despite these theoretical debates, much of archaeology continued to be practiced in ways that drew on multiple traditions, that combined scientific rigor with humanistic interpretation, that used whatever methods seemed most appropriate to the questions at hand. And as the 20th century progressed, the toolkit available to archaeologists expanded dramatically. Geophysical survey techniques that could detect buried features without excavation, satellite imagery and aerial photography that revealed landscape scale patterns, isotopic analysis that could trace the origins of materials and reconstruct ancient diets, ancient DNA that could illuminate population movements and relationships. The excavation site itself, though still central to archaeological practice, was increasingly understood as just one source of data among many, to be supplemented by regional survey, by experimental archaeology that recreated ancient technologies to understand their capabilities and limitations, by ethnoarchaeology that studied contemporary societies to develop models of material culture patterning that might apply to the past, and by ever more sophisticated analytical techniques applied to the artifacts and ecofacts recovered from the ground. A single excavation in this era might involve dozens of specialists, the field director and supervisors who managed the day-to-day work, surveyors who mapped the site with total stations or GPS, soil scientists who analyzed sediments, paleoethnobotanists who identified ancient plant remains, zoo archaeologists who studied animal bones, ceramicists who classified and analyzed pottery, lithic specialists who examined stone tools, and many others, each bringing specialized knowledge to bear on different aspects of the archaeological record. The process of excavation itself had become more refined, more systematic, with careful attention to even the smallest features and finds, screening or flotation of excavated soil to recover tiny items that might otherwise be missed, seeds and small bones and fish scales, the recording not just of what was found, but precisely where, with three-dimensional coordinates for every significant item, and the recognition that modern excavation techniques, however careful, still destroy the site, still remove it from the ground forever, brought an increased sense of responsibility, a duty to record so thoroughly that future archaeologists, with questions and methods not yet imagined, could still learn from the work. Imagine the scene at a major excavation in this mature phase of the discipline, the carefully gridded site with its string lines and datum points, the excavators working with trowels and brushes, removing soil in thin levels, filling out context sheets that document each stratigraphic unit, its soil color and texture, its inclusions and relationships, the finds being bagged and labeled, the daily photographs and measured drawings, the specialists moving between trenches examining unusual finds, taking samples for later analysis, and overseeing it all, the recognition that what looks like mere dirt to an untrained eye is actually a complex archive, a record of human activity written in discarded objects and disturbed soil, in features cut into the ground and filled, in the slow accumulation of occupation debris and the sudden deposits left by fires or floods or abandonment. And at the end of each day, when the tools are cleaned and stored, when the finds are secured and the paperwork filed, there remains the quiet satisfaction of having moved the work forward, of having documented another piece of the puzzle, knowing that in the months and years to come, in the laboratory and the library, the real work of interpretation will begin as artifacts are analyzed and compared, as radiocarbon dates come back from the lab, as patterns emerge from the data, and hypotheses are formed and tested, and slowly, patiently, a picture of life at this place, in this time, begins to take shape. The closing decades of the 20th century brought archaeology into an era of technological transformation, where methods that once seemed like science fiction became routine tools of the trade. and where the discipline found itself engaging with contemporary issues in ways that challenged the comfortable notion of archaeology as a purely academic pursuit, concerned only with the remote past and its reconstruction. Remote sensing technologies, developed initially for military and commercial purposes, found archaeological applications that revolutionized the way sites were discovered and studied. Satellite imagery could reveal ancient road networks and field systems invisible from the ground. Variations in crop growth marking buried walls and ditches, and thermal imaging could detect subsurface features through subtle differences in heat retention, allowing archaeologists to map entire sites without breaking the soil, to understand their extent and organization before committing to the destructive act of excavation. Ground-penetrating radar sent electromagnetic pulses into the earth, recording the reflections from buried features, and sophisticated software rendered these reflections as three-dimensional images, revealing the locations of walls and graves, voids and concentrations of material. And while these images required interpretation, while they could not replace excavation entirely, they allowed archaeologists to target their work more precisely, to excavate where the questions were most likely to find answers, and to leave undisturbed areas that might be better studied by future generations with improved techniques. LIDAR technology, light detection and ranging, proved especially revolutionary in heavily forested regions where traditional survey methods struggled. Aircraft or drones equipped with laser scanners could map the ground surface beneath dense canopy, stripping away the vegetation digitally to reveal topography with extraordinary precision, and in places like the Maya lowlands, where jungle had long hidden the extent of ancient settlement, LiDAR revealed sprawling cities, causeways connecting sites across kilometers of forest, agricultural terraces and reservoirs, a cultural landscape far more extensive and complex than anyone had imagined. These revelations reshaped understanding of Maya civilization, suggesting populations far larger than previously estimated, agricultural intensification and environmental modification on a grand scale, urban planning and infrastructure that rivaled anything in the ancient world. And they came just as archaeologists were grappling with the collapse of classic Maya civilization, seeking to understand how such sophisticated societies could have faltered. What combination of drought and warfare and political fragmentation and environmental degradation had brought an end to an era? The same questions about collapse and resilience, about how societies respond to environmental and social stresses, were being asked of archaeological sequences around the world. What could the fate of Bronze Age civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean teach about cascading failures in interconnected systems? What lessons did the abandonment of ancestral Puebloan sites in the American Southwest hold about drought adaptation and community reorganization? And could archaeology, with its deep time perspective on human-environment interaction, contribute meaningfully to contemporary discussions about sustainability and climate change? These were no longer merely academic questions. Archaeology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries found itself drawn into public debates about cultural heritage and who owns the past, about the rights of descendant communities to control research on their ancestors, about the ethics of excavating burial sites and displaying human remains in museums, about the repatriation of artifacts taken during colonial periods, and about archaeology's responsibility to serve not just the advancement of knowledge, but also the interest of living communities with connections to the past being studied. In the United States, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, fundamentally changed the relationship between archaeologists and indigenous peoples, requiring consultation with tribes, mandating the return of human remains and sacred objects to affiliated communities, and recognizing that Native Americans had rights regarding the study and disposition of their ancestral heritage. And while the law created challenges for researchers, it also opened new possibilities for collaborative work, for archaeology that served indigenous goals and incorporated indigenous knowledge, for a more ethical and inclusive practice. Similar movements occurred worldwide. In Australia, where Aboriginal peoples gained greater control over research on their lands and heritage. In various African nations asserting ownership of artifacts removed during colonial rule. In South American countries restricting the export of archaeological materials, and these developments reflected a broader recognition that archaeology, whatever its scientific pretensions, was always also a political act, that decisions about what to excavate and how to interpret and what stories to tell had consequences for living people and communities. The discipline responded unevenly to these challenges, some archaeologists embracing collaboration and community engagement, others resisting what they saw as constraints on scientific freedom. But gradually, a new model emerged, one that recognized multiple stakeholders in the past, that understood heritage as something living communities have legitimate interests in, and that saw archaeology's role as facilitating understanding rather than simply extracting knowledge from the ground. Concurrently, archaeological methods continued to advance. Ancient DNA analysis became routine, allowing researchers to trace population movements and admixture with unprecedented precision to identify familial relationships between individuals buried together, to detect diseases and dietary deficiencies written in genetic material preserved in bones and teeth, and these molecular insights sometimes confirmed and sometimes challenged interpretations based on material culture, revealing complexities that artifacts alone could not illuminate. Isotopic analysis of human remains provided complementary information. Strontium isotopes in tooth enamel, reflecting the geology of the landscape where someone spent their childhood, potentially revealing migration. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone collagen, indicating diet, distinguishing between marine and terrestrial resources, between C3 and C4 plants, between high and low positions in the food chain, and when combined with other evidence, these chemical signatures helped reconstruct individual life histories, movements between regions, changes in diet over time, social differences in access to particular foods. Residue analysis could identify what had been cooked in ancient pottery, what plants had been processed with stone tools, what substances had been stored in containers, microscopic traces of starch grains and phytoliths and lipids surviving millennia in the microscopic pores and crevices of artifacts, and these traces revealed uses that would otherwise remain unknown. The processing of tubers that left no other archaeological signature, the brewing of beer or fermentation of other beverages, the use of psychoactive plants in ritual contexts, whole dimensions of ancient life made visible through chemistry and microscopy. Digital technologies transformed not just how data was collected, but how it was analyzed and shared. Databases allowed comparison of artifacts across sites and regions. Statistical analysis revealed patterns in vast data sets that would be invisible to unaided observation. Three-dimensional scanning preserved perfect digital records of artifacts and features, and online repositories made collections accessible to researchers worldwide, democratizing access to materials that once required expensive travel to study. Virtual reconstructions brought sites back to life. Computer models showing how buildings would have appeared when whole, how settlements would have looked from various vantages, how light would have fallen in interior spaces at different times of year. And while these reconstructions required interpretation, involved choices and assumptions that might be questioned, they provided powerful tools for visualization, for testing hypotheses about function and use, for communicating findings to professional and public audiences alike. Public archaeology became increasingly important, not just as outreach or education, though those remained vital, but as a recognition that archaeological knowledge belonged to everyone, that the past was a shared heritage to be preserved and celebrated, and that archaeology had an obligation to engage with contemporary communities, to make its findings accessible, to demonstrate relevance and value beyond the academy. Television programs brought archaeology into living rooms, sometimes sensationalizing discoveries, sometimes presenting the painstaking reality of field and laboratory work. And while professionals might criticize oversimplifications or the emphasis on treasure and mystery, these programs cultivated public interest, inspired new generations to enter the field, and built support for heritage preservation and archaeological research. The discipline itself had become truly global, with thriving archaeological communities on every inhabited continent, with practitioners from diverse backgrounds bringing varied perspectives, with research questions reflecting local concerns as well as universal human themes, and with an increasingly sophisticated understanding that there was no single human story, but rather countless intertwined narratives of adaptation and innovation, migration and settlement, cooperation and conflict, all written in the material record waiting to be read. And yet, for all the technological advances and theoretical sophistication, for all the expansion of scope and method, archaeology retained something essential from its earliest days, that fundamental act of careful observation, of patient uncovering, of seeking to understand the lives of those who came before through the fragmentary evidence they left behind. The trowel and the brush remained as important as the satellite and the mass spectrometer. And the basic questions: how did people live? What did they believe? How did they organize their societies? How did they adapt to changing circumstances? Remained as compelling as ever. As archaeology moved into the 21st century, it found itself positioned uniquely at the intersection of science and humanities, employing cutting-edge technologies while pursuing fundamentally humanistic questions, studying the deep past while engaging with pressing contemporary issues, and always, at its core, seeking to bridge the gulf between then and now, to make the distant past present, to recover voices long silent and stories long forgotten, one careful excavation, one analyzed artifact, one tested hypothesis at a time. The deeper we move into the practice of archaeology, the more we encounter not just the mechanics of discovery, but the philosophical questions that lie beneath, questions about time and memory, about what it means to know the past, about the relationship between the fragmentary evidence we uncover and the lived reality it imperfectly represents. And these questions have no final answers, only invitations to think more carefully, to hold our interpretations more lightly, to remain humble before the vastness of what we cannot know. Consider the nature of archaeological time itself, not the neat divisions we impose, early Bronze Age and late woodland and middle formative, but the lived experience of duration, the slow accumulation of generations, each individual life a brief flicker, yet collectively spanning centuries, millennia. And how strange it is that we compress this duration into narratives, into stories with beginnings and middles and ends, when the people who lived it experienced only the eternal present, the day-to-day reality of their own moment, unaware of the larger patterns we now perceive. An occupation layer 10 centimeters thick might represent 50 years or 500, compressed by the weight of subsequent deposits until distinctions of generation collapse into what appears as a single moment. And when we excavate such a layer, when we analyze the artifacts within it as a coherent assemblage, we create an artificial synchrony, treating as contemporary things that may have been separated by lifetimes. And this necessary simplification, this compression of time, shapes everything we think we know about the past. Yet there are moments, rare and precious, when time seems to stand still, when the archaeological record preserves not the slow accumulation of years, but a single instant frozen, the ash fall at Pompeii or Çatalhöyük, the sudden abandonment at Ozet, where a mudslide buried a Macaw village on the Olympic Peninsula, the ice that preserved Ötzi the Iceman in his final hours, and in these moments we glimpse something closer to lived experience, to the immediacy of human life as it was actually experienced, though even here we see only a fragment, a cross-section through time, not the fullness of any individual existence. The objects we recover carry with them a peculiar kind of presence. They were touched by hands now dust, used in ways we can only infer, valued or discarded according to logics we reconstruct imperfectly. And when we hold them, when we examine the wear patterns on a stone tool, or the fingerprints pressed into unfired clay, we encounter something simultaneously intimate and alien, a connection across millennia that is also an unbridgeable gulf, because we can touch what they touched, but we cannot know what they thought, what they felt, what meanings they attached to their actions. Archaeology teaches a particular kind of patience, not just the patience required for careful excavation and analysis, though that is certainly part of it, but patience with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with the permanent incompleteness of our understanding, because no matter how much we learn, no matter how sophisticated our methods become, the past remains fundamentally irretrievable. We have only its traces, its shadows, and from these we build interpretations that are always provisional, always subject to revision with new evidence or new perspectives. And yet this very incompleteness has its own beauty, its own intellectual richness, because it means that archaeology is not merely the recovery of facts, but an ongoing conversation between past and present, between evidence and interpretation, between what we can demonstrate and what we can only imagine. And this conversation is never finished. Each generation of archaeologists asks new questions, brings new assumptions, sees new patterns in familiar materials, and the past, unchanging in itself, nevertheless means something different to each age that studies it. The landscape of archaeological knowledge is vast and varied, from the caves of Lascaux, with their painted aurochs and horses, silent in the darkness for 17,000 years before their rediscovery, to the trading networks of the Bronze Age that connected Britain to Afghanistan, from the monumental architecture of ancient Egypt to the subtle traces of mobile forager camps in the Australian outback. And each context, each culture, each moment presents its own challenges and possibilities, its own invitation to understand how human beings, endlessly creative and adaptive, made lives and meanings in their particular times and places. We have learned that there is no simple trajectory of progress, no inevitable march from simple to complex, from savage to civilized, that human history is rather a branching tree of possibilities, of different solutions to the problems of existence, some leading to cities and empires, others to sustainable adaptations that persisted for millennia without fundamental transformation, and that the values we bring to these histories, our assumptions about what constitutes success or failure, progress or stagnation, shape profoundly what we see and how we interpret it. The archaeology of recent centuries, historical archaeology as it is called, brings its own particular insights, because here the material record can be compared with written documents, with images, with oral histories, and the discrepancies between these sources reveal how much is left out of official accounts, how the lives of ordinary people, of the enslaved and the marginalized, of women and children whose voices were rarely recorded, can be recovered through the things they made and used and discarded, through the physical traces of their existence that survived when their words did not. An enslaved person's dwelling excavated at a plantation site, with its sparse furnishings and the bones of wild animals supplementing meager rations, tells a story that plantation records omit, and the subtle acts of resistance, the hidden shrines, the African-style pottery made in secret, the ways communities maintained identity and dignity under conditions of profound oppression, become visible through archaeology in ways they are not through the written record produced by enslavers. Similarly, industrial archaeology recovers the landscapes of labor, the factories and mines and worker housing that powered economic transformations, but rarely received the attention lavished on the homes of the wealthy or the monuments of state. And in studying these sites, in taking seriously the material conditions of working people's lives, archaeology contributes to a more complete, more honest reckoning with the past, one that includes all voices, not just those privileged enough to leave written accounts. And so we return always to that fundamental act, the careful excavation, the patient analysis, the slow building of understanding from fragmentary evidence, knowing that what we recover is precious, irreplaceable, and yet incomplete, that every answer generates new questions, that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced, and that the past, for all our efforts to know it, retains always something beyond our grasp, something that resists reduction to data and narrative, something ineffable. The excavation winds down as shadows lengthen across the site, the last measurements taken, the final photograph is shot, the tarps secured against the night. And in the quiet that follows the day's work, there is time to reflect on what has been accomplished, on the layers carefully removed and documented, on the artifacts bagged and labeled, on the slow progress toward understanding, and on how much remains unknown, how many questions still linger, how much more there is to discover. In the laboratory, in the months that follow, the work continues in different form: the washing and cataloging of finds, the identification of seeds and bones, the drawing of pottery profiles, the writing of reports, and each of these tasks, however routine it might seem, contributes to the larger project of making sense of what was found, of weaving individual observations into coherent interpretation, of building knowledge fragment by fragment. The conversations continue too, at conferences and in publications, in the classroom and the public lecture, as archaeologists share findings and debate interpretations, as new voices enter the discipline, bringing fresh perspectives, and as the public engages with the past through museums and heritage sites, through books and documentaries, through visits to places where history feels palpable, where the presence of earlier lives seems almost tangible. And perhaps this is archaeology's deepest gift, not any particular fact about the past, though those are valuable, but rather a way of seeing, an attentiveness to traces, a willingness to read landscapes and objects for the stories they contain, a recognition that the present is built on layers of previous presents, each with its own concerns and achievements, its own failures and dreams, and that we are part of this ongoing accumulation, leaving our own traces for future archaeologists to puzzle over, to interpret, to misunderstand, and to illumine. The past is not dead, Faulkner wrote. It is not even past. And archaeology makes this paradox concrete, makes it something we can hold in our hands, a potsherd, a projectile point, a corroded coin, objects that were present then and are present now, that bridge the gap between moments separated by centuries. And in this bridging there is something profound, a dissolution of the boundary between past and present, a recognition of continuity, of connection, of the great conversation of humanity with itself across the expanse of time. As night settles over the excavation site, as stars appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone on those who lived here centuries or millennia ago, there is a sense of completion and of continuation, the day's work done, tomorrow's work waiting, and beyond tomorrow, years of analysis and interpretation, of teaching and sharing, of adding to the great collective project of understanding where we came from, how we got here, who we have been and might yet become. The tools are cleaned and stored, the notebooks closed, the site rests in darkness, and in that darkness, beneath the earth, lie still more stories, more lives waiting to be discovered, more questions awaiting patient excavation, more evidence of human creativity and resilience, and the endless ways we make meaning and home in the world, waiting, patient as the soil itself, for the careful hands and curious minds that will, in time, bring them once more into the light. And so the work goes on, season after season, generation after generation. The great slow unfolding of human history through the study of its material traces, a conversation without end, a bridge between then and now, built one trowel full of earth at a time, one observation, one interpretation, one careful step toward understanding, the endless, fascinating, inexhaustible archaeology of being human, I imagine a single flame, flickering in the darkness of a cave, tens of thousands of years before this moment. The light is small, barely strong enough to push back the shadows, and yet it changes everything, because in that fragile glow humanity begins to see. There is something about light that feels older than memory, older than language, something woven into the very fabric of what it means to gather, to shelter, to make a space our own. And tonight, I find myself tracing that golden thread backward through time, following the soft illumination that has guided us from ancient hearths to the glowing screens that surround us now. The story begins, as so many human stories do, with fire, long before there were cities or farms or written words. There were people sitting in circles around flames, watching the dance of light against stone walls, seeing their own shadows move like spirits in the flickering amber glow. And in those moments, in those first deliberate kindlings of controlled fire, something profound was happening. We were learning to extend the day, to carve out islands of visibility in an otherwise impenetrable night. I picture those early gatherings, the Neolithic people huddled close to their fires, not just for warmth, but for the simple miracle of being able to see one another's faces after the sun had fallen below the horizon. The fire was not merely practical, it was transformative. It turned caves into homes, clearings into sacred spaces, and darkness into something that could be negotiated, managed, even conquered in small and precious increments. The flames would have been fed with whatever wood was dry enough to catch, tended carefully through the long hours, because letting the fire die meant returning to absolute darkness, a darkness so complete that we, who live in a world saturated with artificial light, can barely imagine its weight, its presence, its totality. And so the first interior lighting was not a technology in the way we think of technologies now. It was a relationship, a constant conversation between fuel and flame, between human intention and the wild element that had to be coaxed, maintained, respected. As I follow this thread forward, I see how that relationship evolved, how people began to experiment, to innovate, to find new ways of capturing and carrying light into their shelters, the discovery that animal fat could burn, that certain stones held oil that would feed a flame, that rushes dipped in tallow could be carried from place to place. Each of these revelations opening new possibilities, new freedoms. I imagine a hand reaching for a hollowed stone filled with rendered fat, a wick of twisted plant fiber drawing the fuel upward into a small, steady flame, and suddenly light becomes portable, movable, something that can be placed exactly where it's needed. On a ledge, beside a workspace, near the entrance of a dwelling, the ancient world begins to glow, one small lamp at a time. There is a patience to this history, a slowness that mirrors the very flames it describes, because for thousands upon thousands of years, the fundamental nature of interior lighting barely changed. Fire remained fire, whether it burned in a hearth or a clay lamp or a bronze vessel, whether it consumed wood or oil or wax. The principle was the same: combustion, the transformation of matter into light and heat, a kind of everyday alchemy that our ancestors understood in their bones. I think about the rhythm of those ancient evenings, the way light shaped the hours after sunset, how it drew people together, how it defined the boundaries of the known and the unknown, the illuminated and the shadow, and how In that interplay, entire cultures found their shape. Because light has never been neutral, it has always been a choice, a statement about what matters, what deserves to be seen, what spaces are worthy of extension into the night. And so, as I stand at this moment in time, surrounded by switches and bulbs and glowing devices, I feel a strange kinship with those first fire tenders, because we are all still in our own way trying to push back the darkness, trying to create spaces where we can see and be seen, trying to make our interiors reflect something essential about who we are and how we want to live. The story of interior lighting, I am discovering, is not really about technology at all. It is about the human need to continue, to persist, to find ways of making the night habitable. And in that need, there is something tender, something worth following, lamp by lamp, century by century, all the way from those first cave fires to the soft glow that surrounds us now. The earliest lamps were barely lamps at all. They were accidents that became intentions, discoveries that transformed into traditions. Somewhere in the vast sweep of the Paleolithic, perhaps 40,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, someone noticed that animal fat, when it pooled in the depression of a stone and caught a spark, would burn with a steadier flame than wood alone. And that observation, simple as breathing, changed the nature of human shelter forever. These first lamps were nothing more than shallow bowls of stone, naturally formed or crudely hollowed, filled with whatever rendered fat could be collected from the hunt. Seal blubber in the frozen north, the tallow of deer and auroch in the temperate regions, and into this fuel a strip of dried moss or twisted plant fiber would be laid, drawing the oil upward through capillary action, feeding a flame that could last for hours. I imagine the light they cast, warm and orange, dancing with every breath of air that moved through the cave mouth, throwing shadows that seemed alive, that moved independent of the people who cast them. And in that unstable glow, the painted animals on the cave walls must have seemed to breathe, to run, to hunt across the stone canvas as the flame wavered and swelled. The lamp was not merely practical, it was ceremonial, sacred even, because it allowed people to penetrate deep into the earth, to carry light into chambers where sunlight had never reached, where the darkness was so complete it had weight and texture. And there, in those deepest places, they painted, they gathered, they performed whatever rituals bound them to the world beyond the everyday. Archaeologists have found these lamps, hundreds of them scattered across Europe and Asia, simple objects that speak of sophisticated understanding, the stones chosen carefully for their ability to hold heat without cracking, the wicks positioned just so, the fuel managed with precision born of necessity. And as the millennia turned, as the ice retreated and the climate warmed, as people began to settle in one place and cultivate the earth, the lamp evolved. The Neolithic Revolution brought pottery, and with pottery came new possibilities for containing light. Clay vessels could be shaped specifically for burning, with spouts to hold the wick, with handles for carrying, with lids to protect the flame from drafts. And suddenly, the lamp became a designed object, something crafted with intention, decorated with the same patterns that adorned the storage jars and ceremonial vessels in the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first took root, where mud brick homes began to cluster into villages. Interior lighting became a daily concern rather than an occasional need, because now there were rooms, true interior spaces that required illumination after dark, workshops where pottery was painted and cloth was woven, gathering spaces where families shared meals and stories. The oil lamp of the ancient Near East was a marvel of simple engineering, a shallow bowl with a pinched rim to hold the wick in place, filled with olive oil or sesame oil, burning with a clear, bright flame that produced remarkably little smoke. These lamps could be made by the thousands, stamped from molds, decorated with geometric patterns or images of gods and animals, and they were everywhere, in homes and temples, in palaces and market stalls. I think about the light they provided, how it must have transformed the experience of evening, how it extended the hours of productivity, allowed for gathering after the day's labor was done, created a space for conversation and community that didn't depend on the sun's schedule. The ancient Egyptians refined the oil lamp even further, creating vessels of alabaster and bronze, of gold and silver for the wealthy, of simple clay for everyone else. They used castor oil and linseed oil, balanos oil from the desert shrub, and their lamps burned in temples and tombs, in the homes of scribes and craftsmen, casting light across hieroglyphic texts and delicate paintings. But the Egyptians also developed something else, something that would become equally important to the history of interior lighting. The candle. The first candles were not like the smooth pillars of wax we know today. They were rushlights, the pithy core of rush plants, peeled and dried and then dipped repeatedly in animal fat until they were coated thick enough to burn. These humble lights were used by common people throughout the ancient world because they were cheap, easy to make, and required no vessel to contain them. The Romans, great innovators of practical technology, took the candle and transformed it. They discovered that beeswax, when melted and poured around a wick, created a candle that burned brighter and cleaner than tallow, that produced a pleasant scent rather than the acrid smell of burning fat, and most importantly, that didn't drip and sputter the way tallow candles did. But beeswax was expensive, a luxury reserved for temples and the homes of the wealthy, and so the common people continued to use tallow, rendered from beef or mutton fat, poured into molds, or dipped repeatedly until the candle reached the desired thickness. And these candles, smoky and imperfect as they were, lit the long Roman nights, illuminating the insulae where workers lived, the workshops where trades were practiced, the taverns where wine was drunk and dice were thrown. The Romans also perfected the oil lamp, creating designs so elegant and efficient that they would remain essentially unchanged for 1,000 years. Terracotta, lamps with closed tops and small filling holes, multiple wick holes for brighter light, handles for carrying, chains for hanging. They mass-produced these lamps in enormous quantities, stamping them with maker's marks and decorative scenes, exporting them across the empire from Britain to Mesopotamia. I imagine a Roman household at evening, oil lamps burning in niches along the walls, perhaps a bronze lamp stand in the atrium, casting light across the mosaic floor. The family gathered for the evening meal, servants moving through the rooms with hand lamps, their flames reflecting off the painted walls, the whole space alive with shifting light and shadow. And in the public spaces, the forums and basilicas, the baths and theaters, larger lamps and braziers burned, extending civic life into the hours of darkness, allowing commerce and conversation to continue, creating a nightlife that would not be seen again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. But the fall of Rome brought darkness, literally and metaphorically. As the empire collapsed, as trade routes failed and cities emptied, as the sophisticated infrastructure of Roman civilization crumbled, the quality of interior lighting declined, the elegant oil lamps disappeared, replaced by cruder vessels, simpler technologies, and in many places people returned to the rushlight, to the tallow candle, to lighting methods that would have been familiar to their ancestors 1,000 years before. The medieval period is sometimes called the Dark Ages, and while that term is too simple, too dismissive of the genuine achievements of the era, it is true that for most people, the nights were darker than they had been under Rome. That artificial light was more precious, more carefully rationed, that the hours after sunset were largely given over to darkness and sleep. In the great halls of nobles, tallow candles burned in iron sconces, and on special occasions in great iron candelabras that held dozens of lights. But even for the wealthy, light was expensive enough that it was used sparingly. Servants would snuff the candles when rooms were empty, collect the drippings to be remelted and used again, guard the stores of tallow and wax like treasure. In monasteries, where the religious life demanded vigils through the night, where manuscripts had to be copied and prayers recited in the hours before dawn, candles and oil lamps burned more freely, but even there, the cost was felt, recorded in account books, carefully managed by the cellarer who oversaw the monastery's resources. The common people, the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population, had even less. A single rushlight might be all that stood between a family and complete darkness, and that light would be used sparingly, lit only when necessary. Extinguished as soon as the needed task was complete, because fuel, whether tallow or oil or even the rushes themselves, represented time and resources that could be ill afforded. I think about those medieval nights. How dark they must have been. How completely the world beyond the small circle of firelight or candlelight must have disappeared. How the night was a different country, vast and unknowable, and how that shaped the medieval imagination, populated the darkness with spirits and demons, made the boundary between day and night feel like a passage between worlds. And yet, even in that darkness, innovations continued. The development of the candle lantern, a simple frame of wood or metal with panels of horn or oiled linen, meant that a candle could be carried outdoors without guttering in the wind, could be hung in a stable or workshop without fear of starting a fire, could provide light in places where an open flame was too dangerous. And the slow improvement of candle-making techniques, the development of better wicking materials, the discovery that adding certain substances to tallow could reduce smoke and improve the burn, these small advances accumulated, making artificial light slightly more efficient, slightly cleaner, slightly more reliable, and in certain places, particularly in the Islamic world, which had maintained and built upon Roman knowledge while Europe struggled through its dark centuries, the art of lighting advanced considerably. Persian and Arab craftsmen created oil lamps of astonishing beauty and sophistication, pierced brass vessels that cast intricate patterns of light and shadow, enameled glass lamps that glowed with color when lit, hanging lamps with multiple tiers, each holding several wicks, creating cascades of light in mosques and palaces. The mosque lamp became an art form unto itself, often featuring verses from the Quran worked in gold and enamel, suspended on chains from the ceiling, filled with precious oils, casting a light that was meant to be both practical and symbolic, a reminder of divine illumination, of the light of faith dispelling the darkness of ignorance. These innovations would eventually make their way back to Europe, carried along trade routes, brought back by crusaders, slowly influencing the development of lighting in the West. But that transmission took time, centuries, and for most people in medieval Europe, the night remained largely unconquered, a time of darkness punctuated by small, precious points of light. The Renaissance brought light in more ways than one. As trade revived and cities grew wealthy on commerce, as knowledge flowed back from the Islamic world and the rediscovered texts of antiquity, as craftsmen organized into guilds and began to innovate with new confidence, the quality and availability of interior lighting began to improve, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The chandelier emerged as a statement of wealth and power. Great wheels of wood or iron suspended from the ceiling, holding dozens of candles, their light multiplied by reflection from polished metal surfaces. These were not merely functional objects. They were displays of abundance, proof that the owner could afford to burn so many candles at once, that they could flood a room with light in defiance of the darkness and the expense. In Venice, where glass-making had become an art of legendary sophistication, craftsmen on the island of Murano began creating chandeliers of blown glass, delicate and fantastical, with arms like frozen water, with drops and pendants that caught and scattered the candlelight, transforming a single flame into a constellation of glittering points. These Venetian chandeliers would become symbols of luxury, exported across Europe to palaces and great houses. Their light refracted through crystal into rainbows. But for most people, even prosperous merchants and professionals, lighting remained a significant household expense. Candles had to be purchased or made, wicks had to be prepared, lamps had to be filled and cleaned, and the cost in both money and labor was considerable. The tallow chandler became an essential tradesman in every city, rendering animal fat, adding wax when it could be afforded, dipping wicks again and again into the hot liquid until candles of the proper size had been built up. It was messy work, malodorous work, and cities relegated chandlers to specific districts where the smell would cause less offense, but their product was essential, as necessary to urban life as bread or water. Beeswax remained the premium choice, but it was expensive enough that its use was largely confined to churches and the homes of the very wealthy. The Catholic Church was one of the largest consumers of beeswax candles, burning them by the thousands on altars and in processions, their clean flame and sweet scent considered appropriate for sacred use, and the production of beeswax became intertwined with monastic life, with the keeping of bees, with the cycle of the liturgical year. The Protestant Reformation brought changes even to lighting, as reformers stripped churches of what they considered excessive ornamentation, as the emphasis shifted from visual splendor to the word. The use of candles in religious settings became a point of theological debate, and in some Protestant countries, the demand for beeswax declined, shifting resources toward domestic and civic lighting instead. The 17th century saw the development of new lamp designs, particularly in the Netherlands, where the wealth generated by trade and the distinctive architecture of Dutch homes, with their large windows and well-lit interiors, created both the means and the desire for better artificial lighting. Dutch inventors experimented with lamps that used a cylindrical wick holder, that drew oil more efficiently, that could be adjusted to control the brightness of the flame. These improvements were incremental, small refinements that made lamps burn a bit brighter, use fuel a bit more efficiently, produce a bit less smoke, but over time, these increments added up to significant progress. The Betty lamp, developed in Germany and widely used in colonial America, was a simple but effective design, a shallow covered vessel with a wick holder that could be adjusted. It burned fish oil or whale oil more efficiently than earlier designs, and it could be hung from a hook or set on a surface, providing flexible lighting for working households. But the real transformation in interior lighting began in the 18th century, as scientific inquiry turned its attention to the chemistry of combustion, to the physics of flame, to the practical problem of creating better light. The argand lamp, invented by the Swiss chemist Ami Argand in 1783, was revolutionary. It used a hollow circular wick that allowed air to pass through the center of the flame as well as around the outside, dramatically improving combustion efficiency, combined with a glass chimney that controlled the draft and protected the flame. The argand lamp produced a light that was steady, bright, and remarkably clean burning. For the first time, a lamp could produce light comparable to multiple candles, but using less fuel and producing less smoke. The impact was immediate. Argand lamps were adopted in homes and businesses across Europe and America. They lit the salons where the Enlightenment conversed late into the night, the workshops where craftsmen worked by improved light, the libraries where scholars pored over books without straining their eyes. I imagine the experience of that brighter light, how it must have felt to people accustomed to the dim flicker of candles and simple oil lamps. Suddenly rooms could be genuinely well lit. Work could continue with less eye strain. Reading became easier, more pleasant. The circle of usable light expanded, and the fuels themselves were improving. Whale oil, rendered from the blubber of sperm whales, burned cleaner and brighter than previous lamp oils. The whaling industry, brutal as it was, supplied the oil that lit America and Europe through the early 19th century. Great ships sailed from Nantucket and New Bedford, pursuing whales across the world's oceans, and the oil they brought back was refined and sold, filling the lamps that burned in parlors and counting houses, in taverns and theaters. Candles, too, were advancing. In 1825, a French chemist named Michel-Eugène Chevreul discovered how to separate the components of tallow, extracting stearine, which could be molded into candles that were harder, whiter, and cleaner burning than traditional tallow. Stearic acid candles became the new standard, affordable enough for middle-class households, superior to tallow in every way. And then, in 1850, paraffin wax was developed from petroleum, and candles took another leap forward. Paraffin was even cheaper than stearin, even cleaner burning, and it could be produced in enormous quantities as the petroleum industry developed. Suddenly, good quality candles were available to almost everyone. The soft white light of paraffin candles became the standard domestic lighting, present in homes of every class. But even as candles reached their apex, they were about to be superseded. Coal gas, a byproduct of heating coal to produce coke for iron smelting, had been observed to be flammable since the 17th century, but it was not until the beginning of the 19th century that entrepreneurs realized it could be captured, piped, and used for lighting. The first gas lighting systems appeared in factories, where the investment in infrastructure could be justified by the long hours of operation, by the need for reliable light that didn't require constant tending. William Murdoch, a Scottish engineer, installed gas lighting in a cotton mill in 1798, and the age of piped lighting had begun. London began installing gas streetlights in 1812, and the technology spread rapidly. Gas companies formed, laying pipes beneath city streets, selling gas to businesses and wealthy households, and the nature of urban lighting changed fundamentally. Gas light was brighter than oil lamps, more convenient than candles. It could be turned on and off with a valve. It didn't require trimming or refilling. It transformed the experience of evening in cities. Streets became safer, shops could stay open later, theaters and music halls blazed with light, and gradually, as the technology became cheaper and the infrastructure more extensive, gas lighting moved into middle-class homes. I think about what it must have been like to install gas lighting in a home for the first time, to turn a valve and watch light bloom from the fixture, steady and bright, requiring no more attention, no more lamp filling or wick trimming or candle changing. The convenience alone was remarkable, but it was more than that. It was a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with interior light. For the first time in history, light was becoming a utility, something that could be assumed rather than carefully managed, something that flowed into homes through pipes the way water did. And that shift, subtle as it might seem, represented a profound change in daily life. The gas chandelier became the new status symbol, ornate fixtures with multiple arms, each ending in a gas jet, often supplemented with argon burners for even brighter light. These fixtures were works of art, cast in bronze or brass. Decorated with glass shades and crystal pendants, they hung in the dining rooms and parlors of the prosperous, casting a light that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. But gas had its drawbacks. It consumed oxygen, requiring good ventilation. It produced heat, making rooms stuffy. It created soot, blackening ceilings and walls, and it was dangerous. Leaks could cause explosions. Faulty fixtures could start fires. The smell of gas became a familiar and ominous presence in Victorian homes. Still, for several decades, gas was the pinnacle of interior lighting technology. Cities vied to build the most extensive gas networks. Homes were marketed on the basis of having gas laid on, and the soft hiss of gas jets became the soundtrack of evening in the developed world. And then, almost simultaneously, two new technologies emerged that would change everything, that would bring interior lighting into the modern age, that would make light so abundant, so cheap, so ubiquitous, that it would cease to be something people thought about at all. The kerosene lamp, developed in the 1850s, used a refined petroleum product that burned cleaner and brighter than whale oil. With none of the supply limitations, kerosene lamps, using improved burners based on Argon's principles, provided excellent light at a fraction of the cost of gas, and because they required no infrastructure, they brought good lighting to rural areas, to farms and frontier towns, to anywhere oil could be shipped. For a brief period, kerosene lamps represented the democratic ideal of lighting, affordable, portable, effective. They lit the American frontier, the European countryside, homes and businesses across the world, and they remain in use today in places without electrical infrastructure, a technology over a century and a half old, still serving its original purpose, but the future belonged to electricity. The electric light did not arrive suddenly. Despite what mythology suggests, Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb in a flash of singular genius. Rather, electric lighting emerged from decades of experimentation, from the work of dozens of inventors across multiple countries, each building on the discoveries of those who came before. Arc lamps came first, as early as the 1830s, using the brilliant light produced when an electric current jumped between two carbon electrodes. But arc lamps were too bright, too harsh, too expensive for domestic use. They found their place illuminating lighthouses and theaters, public squares and factories, great spaces that needed intense light and could absorb the cost. The challenge was to create a gentler electric light, something that could replace the gas jet in homes and offices, and that required solving the problem of incandescence, heating a filament to the point where it glowed, but doing so in a way that the filament wouldn't immediately burn up in the presence of oxygen. Joseph Swan in England, Thomas Edison in America, and others in France and Germany all worked on this problem through the 1870s, experimenting with different filament materials, different vacuum techniques, different bulb designs, and gradually, through systematic trial and error, they found solutions that worked. Edison's breakthrough came in 1879, using a carbonized bamboo filament in an evacuated glass bulb. The filament glowed for hours, producing a warm, steady light that was gentle enough for reading, bright enough to illuminate a room, and with continued refinement, electric bulbs began to last for hundreds of hours, long enough to be practical, economical, revolutionary. But a light bulb without electricity is merely a curiosity. And what Edison and his rivals understood was that electric lighting required an entire system: generators to produce power, wires to distribute it, meters to measure consumption, fixtures to hold the bulbs, switches to control them, and most importantly, a business model that would convince people to abandon their gas lights and invest in this new technology. Edison built the first commercial power station in New York in 1882, serving a small district in lower Manhattan, and suddenly, for the first time, buildings could be lit by electricity supplied from a central source. The model was proven, and the race was on to electrify the world. The transition was not immediate. Gas companies fought back, improving their own technology, reducing prices, arguing that gas was safer, more reliable, and for a time, the two technologies coexisted. Many buildings had both gas and electric lighting, hedging their bets, using each where it seemed most appropriate. But electricity had advantages that could not be overcome. It was cleaner, producing no soot or fumes. It was safer, with no open flame, no combustion, no oxygen consumption. It was more convenient, controlled by a simple switch rather than a valve and match, and most importantly, it was flexible. Electric current could power not just lights, but motors, appliances, an entire suite of technologies that would transform domestic life. By the 1890s, electric lighting was spreading rapidly through cities. Street lights were converted from gas to electric. Businesses installed electric lights to attract customers. Theaters and department stores blazed with unprecedented brilliance, and the nighttime city became a spectacle of light, a phenomenon that still defines urban life today. The early electric bulbs produced light that was warm and slightly amber, similar in quality to candlelight or gaslight, a color temperature that felt familiar, comfortable, and as the technology improved, as tungsten filaments replaced carbon in 1906, the light became brighter, whiter, more efficient, lasting thousands of hours instead of hundreds. I imagine the wonder of those early adopters, flipping a switch and watching light bloom instantly. No match to strike, no wick to trim, no waiting for the gas to flow and ignite. Just immediate, clean, silent illumination. It must have felt like magic, like something out of the future suddenly made present. The light bulb became an icon, a symbol of innovation and progress, the very image of having a good idea. And in a remarkably short time, it became ubiquitous. By the 1920s, most urban homes in America and Europe had electric lighting. The infrastructure had been built, the cost had come down, and an entire generation was growing up for whom the flip of a switch was the most natural thing in the world. Rural electrification took longer. Farms and small towns remained dependent on kerosene lamps and candles well into the 20th century, but government programs in the 1930s, particularly in America, brought power lines into the countryside, and the experience of finally getting electric lights, after decades of watching cities glow in the distance, was often described as transformative, life-changing, a leap into modernity. With abundant electric light came new possibilities, new ways of designing interiors, new rhythms of daily life. Suddenly it was easy to light an entire house, every room bright and welcoming, and the old patterns of gathering in one well-lit room while the rest of the house remained dark began to dissolve. The 20th century became a playground for lighting innovation, recessed lights that disappeared into ceilings, track lighting that could be aimed and adjusted, spotlights that created drama and emphasis, and with each innovation, interior spaces became more sculptured by light, more deliberately illuminated. Fluorescent lighting arrived in the 1930s, using an electric discharge through mercury vapor to produce ultraviolet light, which then excited a phosphor coating on the tube to emit visible light. Fluorescent tubes were remarkably efficient, producing far more light per watt than incandescent bulbs, and they found immediate application in offices and factories, stores and schools, anywhere that needed bright, economical lighting. But the quality of fluorescent light was different, cooler, more blue-green than the warm amber of incandescent, and many people found it harsh, unflattering, institutional. It became associated with workplaces rather than homes, with fluorescent-lit offices becoming a symbol of modern white-collar labor, vast open floors illuminated by rows of humming tubes overhead. The mid-century modern movement embraced artificial lighting as an element of architectural design, creating buildings where light was integral to the space, where windows and electric fixtures worked together to create specific moods and effects. Architects like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe thought carefully about how light would interact with their spaces, both natural and artificial, creating interiors where lighting was as important as any other design element. The 1960s and 70s brought halogen lamps, which used a halogen gas to allow the tungsten filament to burn hotter and brighter without degrading, producing an intense white light that was perfect for task lighting. For reading and detailed work, halogen desk lamps became ubiquitous in offices, their bright pools of light enabling the close work that characterized information age labor. Track lighting and recessed cans allowed homeowners to create gallery-like lighting in their own homes, to spotlight artwork or architectural features, to create layered lighting schemes with ambient, task, and accent lighting all working together. Interior lighting had become sophisticated, intentional, a craft in its own right. The dimmer switch arrived, allowing people to control not just whether lights were on or off, but how bright they should be, creating the possibility of mood lighting, of adjusting illumination to activity and preference. And with it came a new awareness of light as something that could be modulated, shaped, used expressively. And then, at the turn of the 21st century, LED technology matured, light-emitting diodes that produced light through electroluminescence rather than heat, using a fraction of the energy of incandescent bulbs, lasting not thousands but tens of thousands of hours, and capable of producing any color of light through mixing different wavelengths. LEDs were not new. They had existed since the 1960s as small indicator lights, but it took decades of development before they could produce enough light to serve as general illumination. And when they finally could, they represented another revolution, as significant as the transition from gas to electric. LED bulbs use so little energy that leaving lights on becomes almost negligible in terms of cost. They produce almost no heat. They last so long that changing bulbs shifts from a regular household chore to a rare occurrence. And they can be controlled digitally, dimmed, colored, programmed, integrated into smart home systems that adjust lighting automatically based on time of day or occupancy. The quality of LED light has improved dramatically. Early LEDs produced harsh, blue-tinged light that many people found unpleasant, but modern LEDs can replicate the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, or produce cool daylight, or shift smoothly between different color temperatures throughout the day, mimicking the natural progression of sunlight from dawn's warm tones through midday's brightness to evening's amber fade. Smart lighting systems now allow for scenes and schedules, for lights that gradually brighten to wake you in the morning, that shift to warmer tones in the evening to promote relaxation, that can be controlled from anywhere via smartphone, that respond to voice commands or motion sensors. Lighting has become not just a utility, but a responsive environment, something that adapts to our needs and preferences with minimal conscious intervention. And yet, for all this technological sophistication, there remains something compelling about older forms of light. Candlelight still graces dinner tables, creates atmosphere in restaurants, marks ceremonies and celebrations, not for its practical value, but for its quality, the way the flame moves, the warmth of its glow, the ancient associations it carries. The same is true of incandescent bulbs, which are being phased out in many countries for efficiency reasons, but which many people mourn, preferring their warm, continuous spectrum light to even the best LED imitations. There is something in us that responds to the light of heat, of combustion, of technologies that connect us, however tenuously, to those first fires in ancient caves. The history I have been tracing, from fire to LED, spans something like 50,000 years, and across that vast sweep of time, the fundamental human desire has remained constant. The wish to extend the day, to push back the darkness, to create spaces where we can see and be seen, where work and community can continue beyond the sun's schedule, but the means have transformed utterly from the carefully tended fire that required constant attention to the switch and the voice command that summon instant illumination. And in that transformation lies a story not just of technology, but of how we live, how we think about our spaces, how we structure our time, how we relate to the natural cycles of light and dark. We have arrived at a curious place in this history, a moment where light has become so abundant that we barely notice it, where the flip of a switch or the tap of a screen summons illumination without thought, without effort, without any sense of the tremendous journey that made such casual abundance possible. And in that abundance, something has been gained, and something, perhaps, has been lost. The gain is obvious. We live in a world where darkness is optional, where we can work and read and move about our homes at any hour, where the night no longer dictates our activities, where eye strain and accidents from poor lighting are increasingly rare, where even the poorest households in developed countries have access to lighting that would have astounded royalty a few centuries ago. But the loss is more subtle, more difficult to articulate. It has to do with our relationship to the natural world, to the cycles of day and night that governed human life for nearly all of our existence as a species. We have conquered darkness so thoroughly that many of us, especially those who live in cities, never experience true darkness at all. The night sky, washed out by light pollution, our circadian rhythms disrupted by the ability to maintain bright light at any hour. I think about what we have traded, the convenience and safety of abundant light, for a certain intimacy with darkness, with the night itself. There was a time when darkness was a presence, something known, something that shaped consciousness and culture, when the night had its own character, its own rules, and when the transition from day to night was a threshold that mattered. Now the threshold has dissolved. Day and night blend seamlessly. We work night shifts under fluorescent brightness. We scroll through phones in bed, bathing our faces in blue light. We can make it perpetually noon inside our homes if we choose, and in doing so, we have stepped outside the rhythm that governed our ancestors' lives, the pattern of light and dark that our bodies evolved to expect. The candle, which served humanity for thousands of years, has become decorative, atmospheric, something we use to create a mood rather than to see by, and in that shift from necessity to luxury, from function to symbol, lies the entire transformation of human experience. Electric light liberated us, but it also severed us from a kind of attentiveness that scarcity required when light was precious, expensive, difficult to maintain. People thought carefully about when and where to use it. They gathered together in the lit spaces. They planned their activities around the availability of light. They maintained a relationship, however unconscious, with the cost of pushing back the darkness. Now we leave lights burning in empty rooms without a second thought. We illuminate entire buildings through the night, though no one is there. We create sky glow so intense that children grow up without ever seeing the Milky Way. And we do this because we can, because light has become cheap enough, abundant enough, that we no longer calculate its cost. But perhaps there is value in remembering, in understanding that the casual flip of a switch represents the culmination of 50,000 years of human ingenuity, that the light bulb overhead contains within it the dreams of countless generations who huddled around fires, who trimmed wicks, who rationed candles, who worked by dim and flickering light because it was all they had. The history of interior lighting is, in a sense, the history of human aspiration, the desire to transcend our limitations, to extend our control over our environment, to refuse to be bound by the sun's schedule. And that aspiration has been remarkably successful. We have achieved a level of illumination that would seem miraculous to people from any previous era. And yet, there is wisdom in the old ways too, in the understanding that darkness has its place, that rest and activity need different qualities of light, that the rhythm of day and night serves purposes deeper than mere convention. Modern sleep science tells us what our ancestors knew intuitively, that exposure to bright light, especially blue-rich light, in the evening disrupts our sleep, that our bodies need darkness to produce melatonin, that the perpetual brightness of modern life comes with costs to our health and well-being. Perhaps the future of lighting lies not in ever greater brightness, but in greater subtlety, in systems that adapt to our biological needs, that provide bright blue-white light when we need alertness, warm amber light when we need to wind down, that dim and shift throughout the evening, helping rather than hindering our natural rhythms, technology in service of well-being rather than mere capability. The candle still has something to teach us, not as a practical source of light, but as a reminder of what light can be: gentle, warm, alive, imperfect, a presence rather than merely a utility. And perhaps that is why we still light candles on birthday cakes and dinner tables, why we still gather around fires when we can, seeking something that electric light, for all its advantages, does not quite provide. There is a quality to natural light, to firelight and candlelight, and even to the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, a continuous spectrum, a relationship to heat and combustion that speaks to something old in us, something that recognizes and responds to light as we knew it for most of our history. The story comes full circle, from fire to fire, because even our most advanced LED systems now try to mimic the qualities of firelight, the warmth, the ability to dim, the color that shifts toward amber as the light lowers. We have traveled an enormous distance technologically only to try to recreate, through sophisticated electronics, something like the light that danced on cave walls 50,000 years ago. And in that circle, there is a kind of poetry, a recognition that progress is not always linear, that moving forward sometimes means recovering something we left behind, that the newest technology can honor the oldest wisdom. The lights around us now, wherever we are, contain multitudes. They are the descendants of those first flames, the inheritors of centuries of innovation, the product of countless minds working to solve the simple problem of how to see in the dark. And when we understand that lineage, when we trace that golden thread backward through time, even the most ordinary light switch becomes a kind of miracle. I find myself thinking about all those nights, stretching back through history, people sitting by whatever light they could muster, talking, working, dreaming, finding ways to continue beyond the sunset, and how that simple persistence, that refusal to let darkness end the day, led eventually to the illuminated world we inhabit now. The journey from cave fire to LED is the journey of human civilization itself, our endless creativity, our determination to improve our condition, our willingness to build on what came before, and our ability to make the extraordinary become ordinary, to transform what once seemed like magic into everyday reality. And so the lights burn on in homes and offices, in streets and buildings, across the world, a testament to ingenuity, to progress, to the deep human need to see and be seen, to gather in the light, to continue, to persist, to make our mark upon the darkness. The glow is everywhere now, so constant that we forget to notice it. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement of all, that we have made light so abundant, so reliable, so ordinary, that we can take it for granted, that we can focus on what the light reveals rather than on the light itself. But every now and then, it is worth pausing, worth looking at the light around us with fresh eyes, with awareness of all the centuries and all the innovations that made this moment possible. Worth remembering that what seems simple, the flip of a switch, the voice command that summons brightness, is actually the culmination of an epic human endeavor. The flame still flickers in memory, in the warmth of well-designed light, in the candles we still sometimes light, connecting us across the vast span of time to those first fire tenders, those first lamp makers, those first people who decided that darkness could be challenged, that night could be negotiated, that human beings could make their own light, and in doing so, could extend the possibilities of what it meant to be alive, to be awake, to be present in the world beyond the sun's decree. And with that thought, the story gently fades, like light dimming slowly, like embers cooling, like the soft transition from illumination to darkness that we have fought against for so long, but which in the end remains a natural and necessary part of the rhythm of existence, the balance, the breath, the endless cycle of light and dark and light again. I stand in a field under a sky that seems to stretch endlessly in all directions, the grass beneath me soft and yielding, and above, nothing but the vast open blue that has called to human hearts since the very beginning of wonder. There is something about looking upward that changes the nature of dreaming, something that makes the impossible feel suddenly within reach. And I find myself thinking about all those who came before, all those who stood in fields like this one, or on cliffsides or in meadows, and felt that same magnetic pull toward the heavens. The air is cool and gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance a bird crosses the sky with effortless grace, its wings catching the light, and I watch the way it moves through that invisible ocean above us, the way it belongs there, as if the sky itself were holding it aloft. For so long, for countless generations, that kind of movement belonged only to birds, to insects with their gossamer wings, to seeds carried on the wind, and humanity could only watch, could only wonder, could only imagine what it might feel like to slip free from the earth's embrace and move through that blue expanse. I think about the old stories, the myths that grew from that longing, tales of feathered cloaks and wax-sealed wings, of inventors who dreamed in wood and fabric, who sketched impossible designs by candlelight, their minds racing ahead of what their hands could build, their visions dancing just beyond the edge of what the world would allow. The breeze picks up slightly, moving through the grass in long sweeping patterns, like waves on an invisible sea, and I can almost feel the texture of those ancient dreams, the weight of all that yearning, all that careful observation of how birds bank and turn, how they ride the currents, how they make the air their home. There is a particular quality to evening light, the way it softens everything, makes the ordinary somehow luminous. And standing here now, I imagine all those forgotten moments when someone stood in similar light and thought, what if we could find a way? What if the answer were simpler than we imagined? What if we stopped trying to fly like birds and instead learned to move through air as air itself moves? The shadows are growing longer now, stretching across the field, and in this golden hour everything feels poised between what was and what might be. And I think about how every great change begins this way, in stillness, in observation, in the quiet accumulation of small understanding building upon understanding. Somewhere overhead a cloud drifts, slow and stately, and I watch its shape change almost imperceptibly, the way it holds together even as it transforms. And there is something in that, something about staying aloft, about finding the balance between weight and lift, between falling and soaring. The grass whispers around me, and I am aware suddenly of standing at a threshold, not just in this field, not just in this moment, but at the edge of a story that changed everything about how humans move through the world, a story that begins with dreamers and tinkerers, with those who refuse to accept that the sky must remain forever out of reach. I can picture them, those early pioneers, bent over drawings, testing materials, calculating angles, failing and trying again, driven by something deeper than mere ambition, something more like love. Love for the challenge, love for the beauty of flight itself, love for the sheer audacious possibility that maybe, just maybe, the thing everyone said could not be done might actually be possible. The light continues to shift, moment by moment, and the sky takes on new colors, pale golds bleeding into softer blues. And I realize that this is where it all begins, in moments like this, in the space between earth and heaven, in the quiet determination of those who looked up and refused to look away. And so the story unfolds, not all at once, but gradually, like the evening itself, like the slow, patient work of understanding how air moves, how surfaces can shape that movement, how human ingenuity might find a way to dance with physics rather than fight against it. I take a breath, and the air fills my lungs. This same substance that seemed so insubstantial, so invisible, and yet contains within it the possibility of holding us aloft, of carrying us across continents, of connecting the world in ways that would have seemed pure magic to those who first dreamed of flight. The field grows quieter still, and I stand here at the beginning, ready to trace the long arc of how we learned to fly. The story begins long before anyone succeeded, begins in the careful watching, in the centuries of human eyes turned skyward with questions that had no answers yet. And if we trace it back far enough, we find ourselves in Renaissance workshops, in the mind of a man named Leonardo, who filled page after page with sketches of wings and mechanisms, drawings that would sleep in notebooks for hundreds of years before anyone understood what he had seen. Leonardo da Vinci stood at his window in Milan, watching birds, studying the way a kestrel would hover motionless against the wind, and his hand moved across parchment, capturing angles, proportions, the complex articulation of wing joints, and he dreamed of ornithopters, of machines with flapping wings that might carry a human body aloft, though the materials of his time, the understanding of his era, could not yet bridge the gap between vision and reality. The centuries rolled forward, and others tried. Inventors in France, in England, brave souls who strapped wings to their arms and leapt from towers and fell, always fell, because they were chasing the wrong dream, trying to become birds rather than understanding what birds understood. That flight is not about flapping, not really, but about shape, about the way air flows over a curved surface. By the time the 1700s arrived, by the time the Montgolfier brothers stood in their paper mill in Annonay, something had shifted. Joseph and Jacques watched smoke rising from a fire, watched how it carried embers upward, and they began to wonder, not about wings, but about containment, about trapping that rising force inside something light enough to be carried. On a June day in 1783, in the town square, they launched a sphere of linen and paper 33 feet across, and it rose, lifted by hot air, climbed to perhaps 6,000 feet, and the crowd below watched in amazement as this impossible object defied everything. They thought they knew about what must fall and what could float. That same year, just months later, a hydrogen balloon rose over Paris, designed by Jacques Charles, and this one carried a man, Pilatre de Rosier, who became the first human to experience sustained flight, rising above the city, looking down at streets transformed into ribbons, at buildings become toys, at a world remade by altitude. And for 25 minutes he hung there between earth and sky, and everything changed. But balloons, for all their wonder, were prisoners of the wind. They could go up, they could descend, but they went where the air took them, and the dreamers wanted more, wanted control, wanted to choose their direction, their destination. The 1800s brought new urgency, new materials, new understanding of air as something that could be measured, calculated, predicted, and in England a man named George Cayley began to think differently about the whole problem, began to see that flight required three separate things working together: lift, thrust, and control. Cayley built gliders, tested them on the hills near his estate, and in 1804 he achieved something remarkable, a model glider that could sustain itself, could maintain altitude, could demonstrate that fixed wings that did not flap, could hold something aloft if they were shaped correctly, if they met the air at the right angle. He understood what others had missed, that a curved wing, an airfoil, creates different pressures above and below, that air moving faster over the top creates a kind of suction, a lifting force, and this understanding, this insight, was the key that would eventually unlock powered flight, though Cayley himself would not live to see it realized. Across decades, across continents, others picked up the thread. Otto Lilienthal in Germany became obsessed with gliding, with the pure experience of hanging in air, and he built glider after glider. more than 18 different designs, and he flew them, launching himself from hills, feeling the wind hold him, learning in his body what could only partially be understood in diagrams. Lilienthal made more than 2,000 flights, and he documented everything, published tables of lift coefficients, described the sensation of controlling a glider with shifts of body weight, and people began to read his work, began to understand that flight was not some distant dream, but a solvable problem, a series of challenges that patience and experimentation might overcome. In 1896, on a Sunday afternoon in August, Lilienthal launched from his usual hill, and something went wrong. A gust caught him, the glider stalled, and he fell. And the next day he died from his injuries, but his last words carried forward. Sacrifices must be made, and they echoed in the minds of everyone who came after. Two of those who studied Lilienthal's work were brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, who ran a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and they read everything they could find about flying machine, devoured Lilienthal's tables, studied Cayley's principles, and they began to see gaps, places where the existing knowledge was incomplete or wrong. The Wright brothers were methodical, patient, and they understood something crucial, that the problem of flight was really three problems, and you had to solve all three. You needed wings that could generate lift. You needed a way to move forward through the air. And you needed a method of control, of steering, of maintaining balance in 3 dimensions. They started with gliders, built their first one in 1900, and they needed a place to test it, somewhere with steady winds, with soft landings, and they wrote to the Weather Bureau, studied climate data, and chose a thin strip of sand on the North Carolina coast, a place called Kitty Hawk, where the wind came frosty, reliable and strong off the ocean. That first glider mostly flew as a kite, tethered, tested, and it taught them that the published tables they had relied on, the data from Lilienthal and others, were wrong. The lift coefficients were incorrect, and this meant they would have to start over, would have to generate their own data, their own understanding. Back in Dayton, in the room behind their bicycle shop, they built a wind tunnel, a wooden box 6 feet long with a fan at one end, and they crafted tiny model wings, more than 200 different shapes, and tested each one, measured the forces, recorded the results, and slowly, painstakingly, they built up a new foundation of knowledge that was accurate. That was theirs. Their second glider in 1901 was larger, and it revealed new problems, issues with control, with stability, and they realized that the tail needed to be movable. That control required the ability to adjust not just the wings, but the rear surfaces, to coordinate movements, to think of the aircraft as a unified system. By 1902, they had refined their design, had added a movable rudder, had developed a system they called wing warping, where wires could twist the wingtips, change their angle to the air, and this gave them the control they needed, the ability to bank, to turn, to recover from disturbances. But gliding was not enough. Gliding was falling slowly, with style perhaps, but still dependent on hills, on gravity, and they wanted true flight, wanted to go where they chose, and that meant power, meant an engine light enough and strong enough to pull them through the air. They asked engine manufacturers, sent specifications, and everyone said it could not be done. Could not build an engine with the power to weight, ratio they needed, so they built it themselves. They and their mechanic, Charlie Taylor, crafted an engine from scratch, 4 cylinders, 12 horsepower, weighing just over 150 pounds. And it was crude, basic, but it was enough. And they designed propellers, not just any propellers, but propellers understood as rotating wings, as airfoils that pushed against the air. And they calculated the pitch, the shape, working from first principles, because no one had done this before. No one had tried to optimize thrust for an aircraft that would fly horizontally through the air. By December of 1903, everything was ready. The glider design proven, the engine tested, the propellers carved and balanced, and they returned to Kitty Hawk, to that windswept beach, set up their camp, assembled their machine, and waited for conditions to be right. On the 14th, they tried, won the coin toss that would determine who flew first, but the machine lifted too quickly, stalled, fell back, damaged the frame, and they spent days repairing it, adjusting, preparing to try again. December 17th dawned cold, wind at 27 miles per hour, and they set up on level ground this time, laid a wooden rail, a track for the machine to roll along until it achieved flight speed, and Orville climbed into position, lying prone on the lower wing, hand on the control lever. The engine coughed to life. The propellers spun, and at 10:35 in the morning, with Wilbur running alongside, steadying the wing, the machine lifted, rose from the rail, flew under its own power for 12 seconds, covered 120 feet, and when it settled back to Earth, everything had changed. They flew 3 more times that day, each flight longer than the last, and on the 4th attempt, Wilbur stayed aloft for 59 seconds, traveled 852 feet, and it was unmistakable now, undeniable. This was controlled, sustained, powered flight. The age of aviation had begun, though the world did not know it yet, did not quite believe, would take years to fully understand what had happened on that beach in that cold December wind, when 2 bicycle mechanics achieved what emperors and philosophers had only dreamed of. The newspapers were skeptical, dismissed the reports as exaggeration, as the fevered claims of provincial tinkerers. And even when the brothers offered to demonstrate their machine to the United States government, to the military, the letters were ignored, filed away, considered too fantastical to warrant serious attention. But the Wright brothers were not deterred. They returned to Dayton to a field called Huffman Prairie, 8 miles outside the city, and there they continued to fly, to refine, to push the boundaries of what their machine could do. And by 1905, they were staying aloft for more than half an hour, flying circles, figure eights, demonstrating a level of control that made it clear this was no accident, no lucky fluke. Word began to spread, not through official channels, but through whispers, through the accounts of farmers who had seen the strange machine circling overhead. And slowly, reluctantly, the world began to pay attention, began to understand that the age of the airship and the balloon was giving way to something entirely new. In France, in those early years of the 1900s, aviation enthusiasts were pursuing their own dreams. Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian living in Paris, was building aircraft of his own design, and in October of 1906 he flew his 14Bs in front of a crowd, covered 220 feet, and Paris erupted in celebration, convinced that Santos Dumont had achieved the first true flight, because they had not believed the American claims, had not seen the Wright brothers fly. The rivalry spurred innovations, pushed designers to test new configurations, new approaches, and across Europe, workshops filled with the sound of engines being tuned, of fabric being stretched over frames, of propellers being carved and balanced, and each month brought news of longer flights, higher altitudes, new records set and broken. By 1908, the Wright brothers finally demonstrated their machine publicly. Wilbur flew in France, at Le Mans, and the European aviators who had doubted, who had dismissed the American claims, watched in stunned silence as he circled the field with a grace and control their machines could not match, banking smoothly, turning with precision, and they understood immediately that the Wrights were years ahead, that they had solved problems the Europeans were still struggling with. The demonstrations changed everything, sparked what historians would later call aviation fever, a sudden explosion of interest and investment, and within months there were aviation meets, competitions with prize money, crowds gathering to watch these fragile machines lift into the air, and every successful flight pushed the dream further, made the impossible more ordinary. In 1909, Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel, flew from France to England in 37 minutes, and this simple journey, this brief hop over water, shattered the psychological barrier that had made Britain feel separate, protected by the sea, and military strategists across Europe suddenly understood that aircraft were not toys, not curiosities, but weapons, tools that could change the nature of war itself. The aircraft of those early years were terrifyingly fragile. Frames of wood and wire, wings covered in fabric doped with lacquer, engines that sputtered and failed, and pilots flew without parachutes, without instruments, navigating by landmarks, by the feel of wind on their faces, and the mortality rate was staggering. Almost every pioneer of those years knew someone who had died in a crash, who had misjudged an approach or suffered an engine failure or been caught by unexpected wind. But still they flew, driven by something beyond reason, by the sheer intoxicating freedom of it, the way the world transformed from above, the way roads became lines and cities became patterns, the way altitude changed perspective, made human concerns seem small and temporary. Glenn Curtiss in America developed his own designs, created the first practical seaplane, an aircraft that could land on water, take off from harbors, and this opened new possibilities, new routes, new ways of thinking about where aircraft could go and what they could do. By 1910, there were air shows drawing crowds of thousands, pilots performing stunts, loops and rolls, flying upside down, pushing the machines to their limits, and some of these pilots became celebrities, their names in newspapers, their photographs sold as postcards. Harriet Quimby, the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, Bessica Raish, who built and flew her own aircraft, these pioneers proving that the sky belonged to anyone with courage and skill. The Great War came in 1914, and aviation was still in its infancy. The first military aircraft were used for reconnaissance, for observation, pilots flying over enemy lines, sketching troop positions, reporting back. And at first, when two aircraft met in the air, the pilots would wave, sometimes even greet each other, because they were part of a small fraternity, a community of those who understood what it meant to fly. But war has its own logic, its own momentum, and soon the observers began carrying pistols, rifles, trying to shoot at enemy aircraft, and then machine guns were mounted, first firing through gaps in the propeller arc, and then, in 1915, a Dutchman named Anthony Fokker developed an interrupter gear, a mechanism that synchronized the gun with the propeller, allowed bullets to fire between the spinning blades, and suddenly aircraft became hunters, became weapons in the sky. The fighter plane was born from this single-seat aircraft built for speed and maneuverability, and pilots who excelled at aerial combat became known as aces, men like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who painted his aircraft bright crimson, who shot down 80 Allied planes, became a legend even to his enemies. And on the other side, Eddie Rickenbacker, René Fonck, pilots who developed tactics, learned to dive out of the sun, to coordinate attacks, to think in 3 dimensions. Aircraft evolved rapidly under the pressure of war. Engines became more powerful, more reliable. Designs shifted from wood and fabric to include metal components, and by 1918 there were aircraft that could reach speeds of 130 miles per hour, could climb to 20,000 feet, could carry bombs and cameras and wireless radios. The war ended, and the world was left with thousands of trained pilots, hundreds of surplus aircraft, and a new question: what to do with aviation in peacetime, how to take this technology born from conflict and reshape it for connection, for commerce, for bringing the world closer together. Airmail service began almost immediately. Pilots flying routes between cities, carrying letters and packages, and these flights were dangerous, flown without instruments through weather, through fog and rain and snow, and many pilots died, crashed into mountains obscured by cloud, ran out of fuel searching for landing fields, but the service continued because it proved something important, proved that aircraft could be useful, could serve a purpose beyond spectacle or war. In 1919, 2 British pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, flew a modified bomber across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland, 16 hours through storm and ice, their windscreen cracking, their instruments failing, navigating by stars glimpsed through breaks in cloud, and when they landed in an Irish bog, when they climbed from their aircraft exhausted and half frozen, they had proven that the ocean was no longer an insurmountable barrier. The 1920s brought a new era, an age of aviation pioneers pushing boundaries, testing limits. Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic solo in 1927, 33 hours alone in the spirit of St. Louis. No radio, no parachute, just dead reckoning and determination. And when he landed at Le Bourget Field in Paris, 100,000 people rushed the runway, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what he had accomplished. Amelia Earhart followed, first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger in 1928, then solo in 1932, and she became more than a pilot, became a symbol, proof that aviation belonged to everyone, that the sky recognized no gender, and she pushed further, flew from Hawaii to California, from Mexico to New York, set records, and then broke them until that final flight in 1937 when she disappeared over the Pacific, searching for a tiny island in an endless ocean. Commercial aviation began to emerge, airlines forming to carry passengers, Pan American Airways, Imperial Airways, KLM. And the aircraft evolved to meet this new purpose, became larger, more comfortable. The Ford Trimotor, the Douglas DC-3, planes that could carry 20 or 30 passengers in relative comfort, that had enclosed cabins, that made flying accessible to those who were not adventurers or daredevils. By the 1930s, air travel was becoming routine, not common yet, not affordable for most, but established, expected, and routes were spreading across continents, across oceans, flying boats, massive seaplanes like the Pan Am Clippers, landing in harbors, refueling at island bases, connecting America to Europe, to Asia, to places that had seemed impossibly distant just decades before, and all the while the technology advanced. Engines became radial, then inline. Superchargers allowed flight at higher altitudes. Retractable landing gear reduced drag. All metal construction replaced wood and fabric, and each innovation built on the last created new possibilities, new challenges to overcome. The military watched these developments, understood that the next war, if it came, would be fought in 3 dimensions, and they invested in bombers, in fighters, in aircraft that could carry tons of explosives, that could fly faster than sound seemed to allow, and designers like R.J. Mitchell in Britain created the Spitfire, a fighter so beautiful it seemed to embody flight itself, all curves and purpose. And in America, in Germany, in Russia, engineers were solving the same problems, creating machines that would soon fill the skies in terrible numbers. The Second World War arrived in 1939, and aviation became central to everything, to strategy, to survival, to the outcome of battles fought across continents and oceans, and the pace of innovation accelerated beyond anything seen before, driven by necessity, by the knowledge that superiority in the air could determine who lived and who perished. Britain stood alone in 1940, facing the Luftwaffe, facing waves of German bombers escorted by fighters, and the Battle of Britain was fought entirely in the sky, Spitfires and Hurricanes rising to meet the threat. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, climbing into cockpits knowing the odds, knowing that each sortie might be their last, and they flew anyway, day after day, until the German offensive faltered, until the threat of invasion receded. The war pushed aircraft to new extremes. Bombers grew massive, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Lancaster, aircraft that could carry thousands of pounds of explosives across enemy territory, that flew in formations of hundreds, darkening the sky. And the crews who flew these missions, 10 men packed into each bomber, faced flak and fighters, faced temperatures far below zero at altitude, and many did not return, fell from the sky over Germany, over the Pacific. Their sacrifice measured in the slow liberation of occupied lands. In the Pacific theater, aircraft carriers became floating air bases, and the war was fought across vast distances of ocean. American Corsairs and Hellcats facing Japanese Zeros, and the nature of aerial combat evolved, became about energy management, about teamwork, about using altitude and speed to overcome an enemy's maneuverability. And pilots learned these lessons in combat. Those who survived, those who returned to teach the next wave, and then, in the final years of the war, came the jets, the Me-262, Germany's desperate attempt to regain air superiority, an aircraft without propellers, powered by turbines, capable of speeds that left conventional fighters behind. And though it came too late to change the outcome, it announced the future, showed that propeller-driven aircraft had reached their limits, that the next era would belong to jet propulsion. The war ended in 1945, and once again the world was transformed. Aviation had proven itself essential, had shown that distance was no longer protection, that oceans could be crossed in hours, that the globe was smaller than anyone had imagined, and the technology developed for war, the long-range bombers, the powerful engines, the navigation systems, all of this could be repurposed, could serve peace. Commercial aviation exploded in the post-war years. Airlines bought surplus military transports, converted bombers into passenger planes, and new designs emerged: the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, aircraft with pressurized cabins that could fly above the weather, that made air travel comfortable, almost routine, and the number of passengers grew exponentially, hundreds of thousands, then millions, air travel becoming not a luxury, but an expectation, a normal part of modern life. The jet age arrived commercially in 1952, the de Havilland Comet, sleek and fast, cutting flight times in half, and passengers marveled at the smooth, quiet ride, at the way jets climbed quickly above turbulence, at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, though the early comets suffered catastrophic failures, metal fatigue causing the fuselage to rupture at altitude, and the fleet was grounded, redesigned, the lessons learned written in tragedy. America's answer came with the Boeing 707, introduced in 1958, an aircraft that defined the jet age, that made transatlantic flight accessible, that carried over 100 passengers in comfort at speeds that seemed impossible just years before. And Pan Am ordered them by the dozen, launched routes connecting every continent, and suddenly London was hours from New York. Tokyo was reachable in a day. The world was shrinking. The Cold War drove military aviation to new heights, literally and figuratively. Spy planes like the U-2 flying at 70,000 feet, above the reach of interceptors, photographing Soviet installations with cameras so powerful they could read license plates from the edge of space. And when one was finally shot down in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was captured, it created an international incident proved that even the stratosphere was no sanctuary. And then came the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft so advanced it seemed alien, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3, over 2,000 miles per hour, flying so high and fast that missiles could not catch it, its titanium skin heating to 600 degrees from friction with the thin air, and it flew reconnaissance missions for decades, retired finally in 1998, still the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built. Commercial aviation continued its evolution. Aircraft grew larger. The Boeing 747 arrived in 1970, a wide-body jet with 2 aisles capable of carrying over 400 passengers, and it transformed international travel, made it economical, made it possible for ordinary people to cross oceans, to visit distant relatives, to experience cultures that had existed only in books and photographs. The Concorde flew in 1976, a supersonic passenger jet cruising at Mach 2, cutting the Atlantic crossing to under 4 hours. And there was something beautiful about it, the delta wing, the drooping nose, the sheer audacity of making supersonic travel routine. Though it was expensive, exclusive, a technological marvel that served the few rather than the many, and it flew for 27 years before retiring, a footnote to an era, a reminder that faster is not always better. The late 20th century brought refinement rather than revolution. Aircraft became more efficient, more reliable. Composite materials replaced aluminum. Fly-by-wire systems replaced mechanical controls. Computers managed everything from navigation to fuel consumption. And flying became the safest form of transportation. Safer than driving, safer than crossing the street, the accident rate dropping year by year. As technology and training improved, Airbus challenged Boeing's dominance, introduced the A320, the A380, the latter a double-decker giant capable of carrying over 500 passengers. An aircraft so large that airports had to modify their gates to accommodate it, and the competition drove both companies to innovate, to create aircraft that burned less fuel, that flew farther, that carried more with less environmental impact. Military aviation entered the stealth era, aircraft designed to be invisible to radar. The F-117, the B-2 Spirit, shapes that seemed to defy aerodynamics, all angles and flat surfaces. And they represented a new kind of warfare, one where detection mattered more than speed, where the ability to strike unseen was worth more than the ability to outrun a pursuer. Drones emerged, unmanned aerial vehicles, first as reconnaissance platforms, then as weapons, Predators and Reapers, flying missions controlled by pilots thousands of miles away, sitting in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada, flying aircraft over Afghanistan. And this created new ethical questions, new considerations about warfare, about presence and absence, about what it means to fight when the fighter is not at risk. Commercial aviation became a global network. Airlines forming alliances, code sharing, making it possible to book a single ticket that would take you from a small town in America to a village in Thailand, with multiple connections, seamless transfers, luggage tracked electronically, and millions of people flying every day. The sky crisscrossed with contrails, each one marking a journey, a purpose, a connection being made. The 21st century brought new challenges: the environmental impact of aviation, the carbon emissions, the contribution to climate change, and engineers began working on solutions: more efficient engines, alternative fuels, electric aircraft for short routes. And the questions became not just how to fly, but how to fly sustainably, how to maintain this incredible connectivity without destroying the planet that made it possible. Aircraft continued to evolve. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, built largely from composites, more fuel efficient, with larger windows, better cabin pressure, designed around passenger comfort, and the Airbus A350, a wide-body twin-engine aircraft that could fly ultra-long routes. Singapore to New York, 19 hours non-stop, redefining what distances could be covered without landing. And through all of this, through more than a century of development, the fundamental wonder remained. The miracle of something heavier than air staying aloft, of human beings crossing continents in hours, of technology that seemed impossible becoming so routine that people complained about legroom, about delays, taking for granted the sheer audacity of flight itself, the evolution from those 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk to modern aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers, thousands of miles. This transformation happened within a single human lifetime. People born before the Wright brothers flew lived to see men walk on the moon, lived to see the sky filled with aircraft, lived to see the world connected in ways that would have seemed pure fantasy in their youth. And standing here now, in this moment of reflection, we can trace the thread, can see how each innovation built on the last, how failure taught as much as success, how the dream of flight, that ancient human longing to slip free from Earth's embrace, was finally realized not through magic or divine intervention, but through patience, through observation, through the careful application of scientific principles and human ingenuity. The story of aviation is the story of possibility, of refusing to accept limits, of looking at the impossible and asking why not. And in that story we find something profound about what it means to be human, something about our nature, our drive to explore, to connect, to transcend the boundaries that confine us. The deeper we look into flight, the more we see it as metaphor, as philosophy made tangible, because to fly is to change perspective, to see the world not as we walk through it, street by street, building by building, but as a vast interconnected whole, patterns emerging that are invisible from the ground. There is something humbling about altitude, about rising above the landscape and watching cities become clusters of light, watching mountain ranges that seemed insurmountable become wrinkles in the Earth's surface. And this shift in perspective, this ability to see the familiar made strange, has changed not just how we travel, but how we think, how we understand our place in the world. The physics of flight, when you truly consider them, remain almost magical. The idea that a curve in metal, that the simple act of moving fast enough through air creates a pressure differential sufficient to lift tons of weight and hold them aloft for hours, is still, even after more than a century, still worthy of wonder. Engineers speak of Bernoulli's principle, of Newton's third law, of the mathematics that govern lift and drag and thrust, and all of this is true, is measurable, is predictable. But there is something in the experience of flight that transcends equations, something that speaks to older dreams, older longings. Every aircraft is a compromise, a negotiation between competing forces, between the desire for speed and the need for efficiency, between strength and weight, between what we want the machine to do and what physics will allow. And in these compromises we see the art within the engineering, the creativity required to solve problems that have no perfect answer. The cockpit of a modern airliner contains hundreds of instruments, screens displaying speed and altitude and heading, systems monitoring fuel flow and engine temperature and 1,000 other variables, and yet the fundamental act remains the same as it was for the Wright brothers. You lift the nose, you feel the aircraft respond. You feel the moment when the wheels leave the ground and you transition from rolling to flying, from earthbound to airborne. Pilots speak of feeling the aircraft, of knowing through subtle vibrations and sounds when something is right or wrong. And this intuition, this connection between human and machine, persists even in an age of automation. Even when computers can land the plane more smoothly than any human hand, there remains something essential about the pilot's awareness, the human judgment that cannot quite be replicated. The history of aviation is written in both triumph and tragedy, in the names of those who succeeded and those who died trying. And we remember both. We remember Lindbergh's solo crossing, and we remember Amelia Earhart's disappearance. We remember the first moon landing made possible by aircraft technology, and we remember Challenger Columbia. The way progress sometimes demands sacrifice, we wish we did not have to make. There is a democracy in modern flight that would astound the pioneers. The idea that millions of people fly every day, that a ticket costing a few $100s can transport someone across an ocean, that flight is accessible not just to the wealthy or the adventurous, but to families on vacation, to students studying abroad, to anyone with a reason to go somewhere distant. And yet this democratization comes with loss. The loss of wonder, perhaps, the way familiarity breeds, if not contempt, then indifference. Passengers scrolling through phones while crossing the continent, complaining about Wi-Fi while traveling at 600 miles per hour, 7 miles above the earth. And maybe this is inevitable. Maybe this is what success looks like, the extraordinary becoming ordinary. But sometimes, on a clear night, when you look out the window of an aircraft and see the stars above and the lights of cities below, when you feel that subtle reminder that you are suspended between earth and space, held aloft by principles that still seem like sorcery, even when you understand the science, sometimes the wonder returns, floods back in a rush, and you remember what a miracle this is. The future of flight remains unwritten. Electric aircraft are being tested, hydrogen fuel cells explored, designs that would have seemed fantastical just years ago are being prototyped and refined. And perhaps the next century will bring changes as profound as the last. Perhaps we will look back at jet fuel and turbines the way we now look back at wood and fabric biplanes, as primitive, as the awkward first steps towards something greater. Already there are aircraft that can fly themselves, that need no pilot. And this raises questions about what flight means, about whether the human element is essential or incidental, and perhaps both answers are true. Perhaps we are building toward a future where the sky is filled with autonomous cargo carriers, with electric air taxis, with vehicles we cannot yet imagine, while also preserving a space for those who want to feel the controls, who want to experience flight not as passengers but as participants. The Wright brothers would recognize the fundamental principles in a modern aircraft, would understand lift and drag and thrust, but they would be astounded by the scale, by the millions of flights per year, by the global network that treats the atmosphere as a highway, and perhaps they would smile to know that their 12 seconds over a North Carolina beach led to this, to a world transformed, to a species that claims the sky as its domain. The light is fading now, the way it does at the end of things. And I find myself back in that field where we began, under that vast open sky, and everything has changed. Or perhaps nothing has. Perhaps the sky is still the same sky, still calling with that same ancient invitation. The story of flight is complete now, not finished, because aviation continues to evolve, continues to surprise us, but complete in the sense that we have traced the arc from dream to reality, from Leonardo's sketches to aircraft that circle the globe without landing, from human beings who could only watch birds with longing to a world where hundreds of thousands of people are aloft at any given moment. And what does it mean, this transformation, this conquest of the air? It means that distance is no longer destiny, that being born on an island or in a landlocked country does not determine the scope of your world. It means that families separated by oceans can reunite in ours, that cultures can mix and influence each other in ways that were impossible when travel meant weeks or months at sea. But it means more than convenience, more than commerce. It means that we looked at an impossible thing and made it possible, that we refused to accept the limitations that seemed absolute. And in doing so, we discovered something about ourselves, about our capacity for innovation, for persistence, for turning dreams into blueprints and blueprints into reality. The evening air is cool against my skin, and somewhere overhead, invisible in the gathering dusk, aircraft are crossing, following routes established by computers, guided by satellites, carrying people to destinations that matter to them, to weddings and funerals, to business meetings and vacations, to reunions and departures, each flight a story, each passenger a purpose. I think about that December day in 1903, about Orville lying prone on the lower wing, about Wilbur running alongside, and about that moment when the machine lifted, when it became something more than wood and fabric, when it became proof that the impossible was just the difficult waiting to be solved. And I think about all the flights since then, all the pilots who climbed into cockpits knowing the risks, all the engineers who refined and improved, all the passengers who trusted their lives to aluminum and jet fuel and the principles of aerodynamics. And the story seems less about machines and more about courage, about faith in human ingenuity, about the willingness to try even when failure seems certain. The stars are beginning to emerge. Those same stars that guided early aviators, that Lindbergh used to navigate across the Atlantic, and they seem closer somehow, more reachable. And perhaps that is what flight has given us, not just the ability to move through air, but the sense that nothing is truly beyond reach, that the universe is not a place we observe, but a place we can explore. The field is quiet now, peaceful, and the story settles into memory, into history, into the long record of human achievement, and it joins all the other stories of how we learned to do what seemed impossible, how we harnessed fire, how we crossed oceans, how we sent signals through the air, how we decoded the human genome, each achievement building on the last, each generation standing on the shoulders of those who came before. And flight, this beautiful, dangerous, impossible thing we made possible, takes its place in that progression, a reminder that we are creatures of earth who learned to move through air, who looked at birds with envy and emerged with understanding, who turned longing into science and science into reality. The darkness is almost complete now, the sky a deep blue fading to black, and the story comes to rest, comes to its natural close, the way all stories must eventually, not with fanfare or proclamation, but with a gentle settling, like an aircraft touching down after a long journey, wheels kissing the runway, the flight complete. And in this quiet ending, in this peaceful return to earth, there is satisfaction, there is wonder, there is gratitude for the dreamers and the builders, for those who believed when belief seemed foolish, who persisted when persistence seemed futile, who gave us wings. The field breathes around me, soft and dark, and somewhere distant, barely audible. The sound of an engine crosses the night sky, and I listen until it fades, until silence returns, until there is only the wind moving through grass and the endless patient stars.